Hound of the Baskervilles, and it's in search of this fearsome beast that we go now on BBC One, exploring the birth of horror.
Sherlock Holmes died in 1893 after chasing the arch-criminal Professor Moriarty halfway across Europe, via the lakes of Switzerland and up into the Alps, to the village of Meiringen, famous for the spectacular falls of Reichenbach, which thunder down the mountainside. After more than 6 years of writing detective stories and novels, Arthur Conan Doyle had had enough of Sherlock Holmes and wanted to kill him off. It was a suitably dangerous setting, and Holmes's friend and chronicler, Dr. Watson, watched the great detective clambering up the path to meet his destiny.
It is indeed a fearful place. The torrent, swollen by the melting snow, plunges into a tremendous abyss, from which the spray rolls up like the smoke from a burning house. We stood near the edge, peering down at the gleam of the breaking water far below us against the black rocks, and listening to the half-human shout which came booming up with the spray out of the abyss.
Dr. Watson's last view of Sherlock Holmes was of him standing with his back against the rock, arms folded, gazing down into the rush of the Reichenbach Falls. After that, Watson was called down to the little village of Meiringen below, while Holmes settled his account with Professor Moriarty, the Napoleon of crime and head of the most powerful syndicate of criminals in Europe. Their meeting turned into a hand-to-hand fight, which then led to them reeling over the edge of the precipice, locked in each other's arms, and plunging into the dreadful cauldron below. Any attempt to recover the bodies, wrote Dr. Watson, or rather Arthur Conan Doyle, was absolutely hopeless. When the short story, The Final Problem, was first published in Christmas 1893, black armbands were worn by businessmen in the City of London, and the shareholders in the Strand magazine certainly got the jitters, as well they might. Conan Doyle simply wrote in his diary, with evident relish, "Killed Holmes. Nothing but nothing could bring him back now." Nothing, that is, except a particularly ferocious black dog which haunted an ancient stretch of moorland in the wild west of England.
Know then the legend of the Hound of the Baskervilles.
Witch has got away.
Know then that the great hall of Baskervilles was once held by Sir Hugo of that name, a wild, profane, and godless man, an evil man in truth.
Bounds! Let loose the pack! May the hounds of hell take me if I can't hunt her down!
The Hound of the Baskervilles, the finest detective story ever written, was based on several gruesome stories from English folklore. Conan Doyle's version of the legend takes place amid the mists of Dartmoor, where a wicked squire chases a village girl across the moor, kills her, and is punished for it by a phantom black dog with blazing eyes and dripping jaws.
Now, you witch!
And so the curse of Sir Hugo came upon the Baskervilles in the shape of a hound from hell, forever to bring misfortune to the Baskerville family.
But Arthur Conan Doyle had a problem. Only one character was capable of confronting such a formidable adversary. It was time for the most famous detective in English fiction to rise from the dead. Mr. Sherlock Holmes of 221B Baker Street, the world's first consulting detective, was just the man for the case. Not only did he have a hard-nosed attitude towards legends like these, do you not find it interesting is the question? Only to collectors of fairy tales is the answer. But he also had a strong streak of the romantic in him, which made him respond to the weird atmosphere of the moor. Although he called his method the science of deduction, it was in fact a rich mixture of free association, close observation, inspired guesswork, and some great one-liners. On greeting clients in his rooms here at Baker Street, he'd say things like, "Beyond the fact that you're a bachelor, a solicitor, a Freemason, and an asthmatic, I know nothing whatever about you." Things like that. Detection is for him an elaborate intellectual game, a way of keeping boredom and depression and the London fog at bay, and best played propped up on a mountain of cushions with a pipe or cigarette or violin close to hand, and of course a hit or two of morphine or cocaine. It's the portrait of the artist as a young detective. Now, the first illustrations of Sherlock Holmes by Charles Doyle, Conan Doyle's father, certainly pick up on this theme of the dreamer or the aesthete. Here he is with a shock of curly hair and a dissipated fallen angel sort of face, sloping shoulders, a tight-fitting fashionable jacket that doesn't quite fit, and a look of "I told you so" on his face. An image which is completely different to the better-known illustrations by Sidney Paget for the Strand magazine. Aquiline features, lean face, a kind of thinking machine. And in fact, Sidney Paget added various features to Holmes that weren't in the original stories. The deerstalker, the ubiquitous pipe, number 221B Baker Street, are really as much to do with the illustrations as they are with the words. And yet Charles Doyle's pictures, though crude, do bring out that aesthetic, dreamy side, which Sidney Paget's much better-known ones don't. The dreamer and the man of action. These two sides of the personality of the consulting detective seem to me to point to two sides in the personality of Arthur Conan Doyle. Arthur Conan Doyle had created the most famous fictional detective in the world with his science of deduction, based in part on the observation of symptoms or clues which he'd learned as a medical student in Edinburgh University. He'd been a general practitioner throughout the 1880s, but his writings had attracted much more attention than his surgery hours, and so he'd become a full-time writer instead. Success as an author meant he could indulge his growing interest in spiritualism. The paradox is that while Sherlock Holmes remained the great rationalist, his creator, Conan Doyle, was fascinated by the spirit world and the paranormal, and was to become the greatest personality or crusader the spiritualist movement ever attracted. By the early 1900s, it had become a fashionable craze to dabble in. Just as Sherlock Holmes was both a rationalist and a romantic, so Conan Doyle believed in the supernatural and simultaneously invented a character who explained it all away. The only Holmes novel which brought the two together was the Hound of the Baskervilles. It all began in Cromer, Norfolk, on the east coast of England, in March 1901, 7 years and 3 months after Holmes's death, when Arthur Conan Doyle was on a short golfing holiday with his friend, a young journalist called Bertram, or Bobbles, Fletcher Robinson. One tea time, when the wind from the North Sea was blowing too strongly for the usual round of golf, the two men repaired to the sitting room of their hotel, the Royal Links. Inside, they began to talk of the myths and magic of Norfolk. In the course of a long tea-time conversation, Robinson told Doyle of the legend of a phantom black dog which haunted the countryside. Now, the folklore of the British Isles is littered with stories of black dogs, whole packs of them, and there are black dog lanes in villages all over the country, still. But they're usually fairly friendly creatures who warn of some impending disaster or haunt some location where a terrible accident has happened. The one big exception is Black Shuck or Old Shuck of Norfolk. Shuck or Scucker, meaning the demon in Anglo-Saxon. Old Shuck was said to come out at dusk, a huge, shaggy creature the size of a calf, easily recognizable because of his saucer-shaped eyes, weeping red fire. No one who caught sight of Black Shuck or felt his breath on the neck would survive until daybreak. Black Shuck is one of the most ferocious dogs in the whole of English folklore, and it's likely that Fletcher Robinson brought him up in the course of the conversation. Conan Doyle, who to judge by his stories detested dogs of all descriptions and was always fascinated by the spirit world, immediately had his imagination fired up by the idea, and the two men began to plot a story based upon it. There must have been a copy of a very recent issue of the Strand magazine lying around as well, the issue for December 1900, because it contained a short story called Followed by detective story writer Mrs. L.T. Mead, and the entire story hinges on a monstrous black beast, thought to be magic, but not really. In this case, a huge Tasmanian snake. The climax involves the snake chasing the girl across the plain towards the ancient temple of Stonehenge, following a stolen boot which has been covered in snake-attracting powder. And in the end, the snake is shot, and all except the villains live happily ever after. Now, if you substitute a hound for the snake, what you've got is virtually the entire plot of what was to become the Hound of the Baskervilles. So, the black dog legend plus this story encouraged Conan Doyle to scribble a quick note to his mother from here at the Royal Links Hotel. Fletcher Robinson came here with me, and we're going to do a small book together, A Real Creeper, Your Own A. The real creeper, as he put it, was beginning to take shape. Conan Doyle arranged to visit Fletcher Robinson at his home, Park Hill House, Ipplepen, on the edge of Dartmoor in the west of England. Here they began the process of plotting out their story. The game was afoot. Now, the coachman and groom at Park Hill was one Henry or Harry Baskerville, who much later recalled that Fletcher Robinson and Conan Doyle would write and talk late into the night, night after night, in the billiard room. Harry Baskerville, meanwhile, sat and watched and listened while he polished his master's boots, and he always reckoned that Fletcher Robinson had actually written whole chunks of the finished story, notably the manuscript of 1742 describing the curse of the Baskervilles and the wicked ways of Hugo, and that Conan Doyle and Fletcher Robinson had both asked him for permission to use his name in the story. So, Sir Henry Baskerville was based on plain old Harry. Harry spent the rest of his life claiming it was his name, Baskerville, that was used in the book. Nearby Haytree House had been the home of the Baskerville family before they hit hard times. But was Harry right? It remains an unsolved mystery, for there's another branch of the Baskerville family and another candidate for Baskerville Hall, which also has a legend of a hound. In this sinister-looking country house lived the Baskervilles of Claro Court, in the border country between England and Wales. Their family coat of arms shows prominently a creature with a broken lance pointing upwards through its mouth and 5 drops of blood. It was said by some to refer to a family legend of a faithful hound who warned the heir of the Baskervilles that a wolf was at the door. His master got so fed up with the hound's whinging that he drove the shaft of his spear through the hapless creature's neck before he'd realized his mistake. There really was a wolf at the door. From then on, whenever a Baskerville died, the hound would materialize at night, complete with spear. Now, is the creature at the top of the family crest a wolfhound, as some have suggested, or a wolf? Difficult one. Anyway, the story goes that Arthur Conan Doyle came to stay here in the Welsh border country in 1897 or 1898, visited Claro Court, and subsequently asked the Baskerville family if they minded him using their name for his novel. They agreed, it said, on the strict condition that he relocate the story elsewhere, for fear that any stigma might attach to the family, and to keep the tourists at bay. The Hound of the Baskervilles, it seems, was bad for their image. From here on in, the plot most definitely thickens. For the Baskervilles of Claro Court intermarried with their neighbours, the Vaughans of Hurgist or Hargest Court, a few miles away, a farmhouse which is all that remains of what was once a great medieval border castle. The Vaughans most certainly had a legend of a black dog associated with their family, a huge and vicious supernatural boarhound. The legend was attached to one Thomas Vaughan, who terrorized the local priests and farmers until his death in 1469. In the early 13th century church at nearby Kington, in the south or Vaughan Chapel, is this magnificent tomb. It shows 2 life-sized figures, Thomas or Black Vaughan, and next to him his wife Eleanor Gethin or Eleanor the Terrible, both carved in alabaster. Now Thomas Vaughan doesn't look that sinister, but then again, as Dr. Watson says when he looks at the portrait of Hugo Baskerville, it was not a brutal countenance, but it was prim and hard and stern. Over on the wall opposite is the family memorial of the Vaughan family, which shows how the Vaughans and the Baskervilles intermarried on various occasions, and might explain how the legend of the black dog was transferred over time from one family to the other. Now, whether or not Conan Doyle really did visit this neighbourhood and pick up on the local folklore from the locals, there is in fact some hard evidence of a connection which has only recently been rediscovered. And it comes from the editor of the Strand magazine, no less. He wrote, sometime after the event, that Fletcher Robinson's main contribution to the story had been, and I quote, to introduce Conan Doyle to the tradition of the fiery hound in a Welsh guidebook. So he did know all about the Welsh connection, but not from Welsh people. And if this is true, the hound isn't Black Shuck of Norfolk, but the hound of the Vaughan Baskervilles of Hurgist Ridge, transposed to Dartmoor. To begin a week of detailed research for their book, Harry Baskerville drove Conan Doyle and Fletcher Robinson around Dartmoor in a horse-drawn coach.
Here we are, Sir Henry, on famous Dartmoor. And what a history it has. You see those rocks over there? Actually, they're stone houses built by Neolithic man 50 or 100,000 years ago. And over there, beyond that hill, those dark spots, that's the great Grimpen Mire. as treacherous a morass as exists anywhere. Thousands of lives have been sucked down into its bottomless depths.
Dartmoor was, and still is, a wild stretch of wilderness, littered with standing stones, the remains of Neolithic dwellings, and ancient circles where it was said horses sensed the atmosphere of the place and would refuse to enter. Victorian writers who loved to collect folk tales and legends found more of them on Dartmoor than virtually anywhere else in Britain, and Fletcher Robinson, who was a local landowner, had quite a collection. The two friends trekked up to the rock hills called tors or towers, which stand out in the windswept landscape like islands. From the top, an observer could watch anything that moved for miles around. The sort of place, Doyle thought, where a fugitive could hide away, unseen for weeks. Arranged below them, they could see the Neolithic stone circle of Grim's Pound. Grim was an Old English nickname for the pagan god Odin, and so Grim's Pound came to mean, in Christian times, the enclosure of the devil. Fletcher Robinson recalled, "It was one of the loneliest spots in Great Britain." They passed the then working shallow tin mines with their chimneys, shafts and surrounding cottages. The mining industry on Dartmoor went back hundreds of years, an attempt to turn the wilderness into a working landscape. Fletcher Robinson and Conan Doyle began to weave the atmosphere of the landscape and the stranger features of the moor into their story. Their destination was the village of Princetown in the heart of the moor, near to His Majesty's prison, which housed many of the most dangerous criminals of the day. Very sad, said Conan Doyle, but it gave them the idea for another twist or clue which went into the plot. Harry Baskerville deposited them at Princetown, where they made Rose Duchy Hotel their base for further explorations of the remote, dangerous parts which a coach couldn't reach. In between walking tours, they consulted a variety of books, maps and guides of the moor. Conan Doyle wrote to his mother,
Princetown. Robinson and I are exploring the moor together over our own book. I think it will work splendidly. Indeed, I have already done half of it. And it is a highly dramatic idea which I owe to Robinson.
The books they read probably came from Fletcher Robinson's collection, and they must have included these two by the Reverend Sabine Baring-Gould, historian, novelist, folklorist and rector of the remote Dartmoor parish of Lew Trenchard. Because this one, A Book of Dartmoor, published the previous year, contained a wealth of detail about escaped convicts from nearby Princetown prison, some of whom tried to make contact with their relatives on the moor, on the treacherous bogs and mires where Dartmoor ponies were sometimes known to sink to their doom, on the Neolithic huts and standing stones which littered the place and which Baring-Gould had made his special study, and the weird sounds which could be heard on the moor at night, resembling the baying of a hellhound, plus their explanations. Now this book presented Dartmoor as a place of mist and legend and wilderness, not as a modern working landscape at all, and it's likely that Robinson and Doyle used it as they explored the moor together, because whole chunks of it, not to mention the atmosphere of A Book of Dartmoor, found their way into the finished novel. Where the writing is concerned, Conan Doyle seems to have put the story together very quickly indeed, distilling on the run his experiences of the moor and his researches. The one surviving manuscript chapter of The Hound of the Baskervilles, or Baskervilles as Conan Doyle would no doubt have called it, is entirely in his handwriting, no trace of Fletcher Robinson, and it reveals that he originally intended to include real place names and real people in the story, the town of Newton Abbot, the mayor of Plymouth, But he subsequently thought better of this and changed these to the fictional town of Coombe Tracy and, instead of the mayor, the fictional Sir John Morland. So Conan Doyle was transforming his impressions of the moor and his researches into fiction and drama in the actual process of writing. As Fletcher Robinson put it, Dartmoor, the great wilderness of rock and bogs that cuts Devonshire in two parts, certainly appealed to Doyle's imagination. A short distance from Rose Duchy Hotel is Fox Tor Mire. It's truly one of the most treacherous and deceptive places on the moor. Concealed beneath an innocent-looking pillow of moss and grass lie deep pools of foul, muddy slime. In Doyle's imagination, the mire and the tin miners' cottages which surround it would become the location for the climactic chapters of his story and the home of the Hound of the Baskervilles.
You notice those bright green spots? That's the Great Grimpen Mire. A false step yonder means death to man or beast. Only yesterday I saw one of the moor ponies wander into it. He never came out. I saw his head for quite a long time, craning out of the bog hole, but it sucked him down at last. It is an awful place.
For Conan Doyle, it was just the sort of grim place where a predatory beast might have its lair. Or maybe its kennel. At this stage in their researches, Fletcher Robinson must have mentioned a piece of West Country folklore which would really have set Conan Doyle's imagination on fire. Another phantom hound, this time a local one which terrorised the neighbourhood around Buckfast Lee. A Dartmoor legend of the wicked squire Richard Cabell, or Cable, buried near Buckfast Abbey in about 1672. One story goes that Cabell cruelly drove his wife out of the manor house and across the moor. As punishment for this, he was chased by a pack of phantom wished hounds breathing fire until he dropped down dead. Richard Cabell, regarded locally as a kind of vampire, was buried next to the parish church in a tomb that would make sure he could never rise again from the dead. The legend still has it that if you walk 13 times around this graveyard anti-clockwise and then place the tip of your little finger in this keyhole, the hungry vampire will bite it off, because the diabolical squire is still trying to get out. To enter this tomb at all is to take one hell of a risk. And that was after all the precautions that had been taken inside. Because to prevent Cabell even being tempted to rise from the grave, his coffin was put inside a stone box with this great stone slab placed on it, and it was said an iron stake hammered through his heart to nail him down. The stone slab was encased in this bizarre pagoda or penthouse structure, and the penthouse structure was encased in iron railings. Now, even during the Second World War, when iron railings such as these were required for the war effort, the local villagers insisted that they stayed put. And here, in 1672, the year the squire died, the stonemason carved the single word Ricus, or Richard, but didn't manage to carve the following word, Cabell. Was he interrupted in his work? Did he feel just behind him some great black beast shaped like a hound before he ran for his life? Who knows? Now clearly, to confront such palpable evil wherever it came from, Fletcher Robinson and Conan Doyle needed some larger-than-life master of destinies who could credibly stand up to it. And as Conan Doyle wrote, why should I invent such a character when I have one already in the form of Sherlock Holmes? Sherlock Holmes was poised for a most spectacular comeback.
Sir Charles lay on his face, his arms out, his fingers dug into the ground, and his features convulsed with some strong emotion, to such an extent that I could hardly have sworn to his identity. There was certainly no physical injury of any kind, but some little distance off, footprints, Mr. Holmes. They were the footprints of a gigantic hound.
They were the footprints of a gigantic hound. Now, those words must be among the most dramatic chapter endings in all of literature, a real page-turner, because Dr. Watson says at the beginning of the next chapter, "I confess that at these words a shudder passed through me." Now, it turns out that Sir Charles Baskerville may have fallen victim to an ancestral family curse, or there may be some more down-to-earth explanation. So Sherlock Holmes dispatches Dr. Watson down to Dartmoor on the Paddington train, Paddington to Exeter to Newton Abbot, to keep an eye on Sir Charles's heir, Sir Henry Baskerville, and to send regular reports back to Baker Street on anything he thinks is suspicious. Sherlock Holmes says very publicly that he's unable to go to Baskerville Hall in person because he's tied up with a blackmailing case in London. But in fact, he travels separately down to Dartmoor, incognito, so he can continue his investigations unseen. It's an ugly, dangerous business, Watson, and the more I see of it, the less I like it.
And now, if you look, Baskerville Hall, the home of your ancestor, Sir Henry.
If ever there really was a model for Baskerville Hall, this was it. Lew Trenchard Manor House, the remote Dartmoor home of the rector and collector of folk tales, the Reverend Sabine Baring-Gould, whose books Conan Doyle and Fletcher Robinson had thoroughly digested. The house looks just like the description in the novel. Assuming, as Sherlock Holmes does, that the Hound wasn't supernatural at all, but that someone is using the legend of the Black Dog for his own evil purposes, probably for money, there was a small army of possible suspects, beginning, of course, with the butler, who's caught behaving most oddly in the night.
What are you doing, Barrowman?
Oh, nothing, sir. It was the window.
The window?
Move the candle about, quickly. I'll swear I saw a light out there on the moor as soon as you picked up the candle. There's someone out there signaling to the house. Come on.
Then there's the apparition on the moor who seems to be making signals to the butler, but who turns out to be an escaped convict from Princetown Prison and the butler's brother-in-law. And there's the equally mysterious figure whom Dr. Watson has sighted near the Neolithic huts at Grimspound, not to mention several eccentric locals, including a butterfly collector called Stapleton. All of them possible murderers, if indeed it is a case of murder. Sir Henry, meanwhile, will insist on wandering around the moor at night, despite being warned against it. When the mysterious figure turns out to be none other than Holmes himself, who's been living in one of the ancient stone huts, it's no wonder that Watson feels thoroughly confused.
There are still some gaps to be filled in, but all in all, things are becoming a little clearer.
Not to me, I assure you. Still a hopeless jumble. Mr. Franklin, Dr. Mortimer, the Barrowmans. Put it all together, and what have you got?
Murder, my dear Watson. Refined, cold-blooded murder.
Murder?
There's no doubt about it in my mind. Or perhaps I should say in my imagination, for that's where crimes are conceived and where they're solved. In the imagination.
But there's been no murder. Unless you mean Sir Charles. And the facts clearly indicated that he died from heart failure.
That's why so many murders remain unsolved, Watson. People will stick to facts.
It's Henry! He's dead.
Skull crushed in.
The convict. Thank heaven. That's the man I shot at the night we arrived. The man Barrowman was signaling to. Who is it?
A Notting Hill murderer. He escaped from prison last month. Been hiding on the moor ever since.
Holmes eliminates all except one of the suspects, but doesn't have enough evidence and needs to catch him red-handed. So the detective arranges for Sir Henry Baskerville deliberately to walk across the misty moor at night in order to flush out the murderer, with cliffhanging results.
I sprang to my feet, my inert hand grasping my pistol, my mind paralyzed by the dreadful shape which had sprung out upon us from the shadows of the fog. A hound it was, an enormous, coal-black hound.
He's coming.
But not such a hound as mortal eyes have seen. Fire burst from its open mouth. Its eyes glowed with a smouldering glare. Its muzzle and hackles and dewlap were outlined in flickering flame. Holmes and I both fired together, and the creature gave a hideous howl. It did not pause, however, but bounded onwards.
Which way? For heaven's sake, which way?
There. No, there.
Far away on the path, we saw Sir Henry looking back, glaring helplessly at the frightful thing which was hunting him down. But the next instant, Holmes had emptied 5 barrels of his revolver into the creature's flank.
All right, Sir Henry.
The Hound is dead.
Doctor.
Watson. Yes, Doctor.
The Hound turns out to have been purchased at a pet shop in the Fulham Road in London and covered in phosphorus paint to enhance its terrifying appearance. So in the story, ancient folklore and horror give way to modern crime.
Phosphorus.
And Holmes is there in the final pages to explain it all away.
The person who wanted to snuff out your life, Sir Henry, was the same one who plotted to kill your uncle. He wanted to get you both out of the way so that he could lay claim to this place, to the whole Baskerville estate. In tracing back his lineage, he discovered not only that he was the next of kin, but also learned of that old legend about the Hound. So he brought the Hound to life.
You knew this was going to happen?
How could you know?
The most amazing instance of a throwback that I've ever seen. And you can see for yourself.
Stapleton! One move and I'll shoot.
You're under arrest, Stapleton, for the murder of Sir Charles Baskerville, the murder of a convict, and the attempted murder of Sir Henry.
You can't arrest me, Holmes. Now, one move from any of you and I'll blast you all to kingdom come.
The Hound of the Baskervilles was first published in the Strand magazine, much to the relief of the shareholders, in August 1901. Now, Conan Doyle had originally asked for £50 per 1,000 words, but when he decided to make it a Sherlock Holmes story, he upped the figure to £100 per 1,000 words, because, as he put it, the revival of Holmes is likely to attract a great deal of attention, the understatement of his career, by a man who wasn't much given to understatement. But he stipulated something else as well, and in writing. He said, "Fletcher Robinson's name must appear with mine. I can answer for the yarn being all my own in my own style, but he gave me the central idea and the local colour, and so I feel his name must appear. And for every £100 Conan Doyle got, Robinson was to get £30. And that's why, when the first instalment of The Hound of the Baskervilles came out in the Strand magazine, it bore a most unusual footnote. It said, "This story owes its inception to my friend, Mr. Fletcher Robinson, who has helped me both in the general plot and in the local details. ACD." Now, in later editions, published after Fletcher Robinson's death, this effusive acknowledgement which was an admission of a collaboration between the two men, was toned down to a casual thank you for a chance remark by that fine fellow Fletcher Robinson, a chance remark about a spectral dog. That remark was the inception of the book, said Arthur Conan Doyle, but I should add that the plot and every word of the actual narrative were my own. So, no longer a collaboration, just a chance remark. No longer a plot, but an idea about a dog. Now, Conan Doyle refused to admit that The Hound of the Baskervilles represented the definitive resurrection of Sherlock Holmes after his death at the Reichenbach Falls. The case predated his death, he said, and was found among his papers. But the writing was on the wall. There were queues around the block at the Strand magazine, which went into a record 7 printings. And in America, the publishers had to keep holding up the first edition. Such was the incredible demand for it. There was no doubt about it now. Sherlock Holmes just had to rise from the grave. Meanwhile, American actor-manager William Gillette's play, called Sherlock Holmes, was running to packed houses at the Lyceum Theatre in London.
Believe me, I meant no...
Conan Doyle had given permission for the adaptation, which came out at the same time as the first instalment of The Hound of the Baskervilles.
Even my...
Gillette had asked if he could make Holmes, uncharacteristically, fall in love. To which Conan Doyle replied, "You may marry the detective or murder him or do anything you like with him." He didn't appear to care.
You're not the only one who can tell things from small detail.
Your powers of observation are somewhat remarkable, Miss Faulkner, and your deduction is quite correct. I suppose, indeed I know, I love you, but I know...
But whether he liked it or not, by popular demand, Conan Doyle and his great detective were wedded to each other for life.
Poison, drug...
The commercialization of Sherlock Holmes began here.
Sweet life. I have every reason to say goodbye and farewell. Every reason.
The way to Holmes's heart, it seems, is through his pipe. So why has the story been so successful? Reckoned by most people to be the finest detective story in the English language. Is it because of Sherlock Holmes? Well, as a rival Victorian author put it in an outrageous pun, though he might be more humble, there's no police like Holmes. And he's on top form in The Hound of the Baskervilles. Eccentric, clever, a heroic individual. His rest since the Reichenbach Falls has evidently done him good. Even in the world of today's fictional law enforcers, with their heavy artillery, who tend to be professional policemen rather than armchair detectives, players rather than gentlemen, there's still no police like Holmes. And yet, Sherlock Holmes actually disappears from chapter 6 to chapter 11 of The Hound of the Baskervilles, the whole central section of the book, leaving Dr. Watson to explore Dartmoor by himself. And there, I believe, lies the secret to the success of the book. The moor itself, a nightmare place of mist and legend and antiquity, a wilderness which has defied successive attempts to civilize it from prehistoric times onwards, a place where, as Dr. Watson puts it, you leave all traces of modern England behind you. The moor creates a threatening atmosphere from beginning to end, a grim sort of charm. Life, says Watson, has become like the Great Grimpen Mire, with no guide to point the track. The Dartmoor of The Hound of the Baskervilles is such a strong image that it's even coloured our perceptions of the place today, nearly 100 years later, as a barren, deserted landscape rather than a working place. Now, there were people working on the moor as farmers and as tin miners, even in Conan Doyle's day, but you wouldn't know that from the book. This combination of the moor, plus Sherlock Holmes, plus, of course, a great shaggy dog story, have made The Hound of the Baskervilles not just a real creeper, but a classic. In all the excitement, the contributions of two men had been largely forgotten. Bertram Fletcher Robinson certainly contributed to the book and may well have done a lot more. Harry Baskerville showed his master and Arthur Conan Doyle around the moor and always claimed that he donated his name to the story. This was one of his proudest possessions, a copy of the first edition inscribed, "To Harry Baskerville from Fletcher Robinson, with apologies for using the name." That's the name, note, not your name. The name could equally well apply to the Baskervilles of the Welsh border country. Had Conan Doyle downgraded Harry Baskerville's contribution and that of his master? Or had he cleverly covered up the identity of the Welsh Baskervilles, as he had undertaken to do? Complicated, my dear Watson. Sherlock Holmes would never be quite the same again. Conan Doyle wrote 3 more collections of cases and 1 more novel, but the enthusiasm he'd put into the earlier stories had gone. He dropped the detective's more eccentric personal habits, the drug-taking, the bohemian way of life, and made him seem much less interesting. Conan Doyle wrote more and more about his other interests, but never attempted to mix his 2 lives, the rational and the spiritual, again. The final Sherlock Holmes case, His Last Bow, was set in August 1914, and at the end of it, the famous detective saw the real nightmares which were on their way.
Holmes shook a thoughtful head. "There's an east wind coming, Watson. Such a wind as never blew on England yet. It will be cold and bitter, and a good many of us may wither before its blast. But it's God's own wind, nonetheless. Start her up, Watson. It's time we were on our way."
The withering east wind, which Sherlock Holmes predicted in August 1914 would blow on England, was soon to become a cataclysm. Here in the valley of the Somme, 2 years later, over 500,000 Allied troops were killed or wounded in a single military engagement, 60,000 of them on the first morning. These were the real-life horrors of the 20th century, which made the Victorian horror stories, or fantasies is perhaps a better word, seem not only tame, but curiously reassuring, like your favourite box of chocolates. Originally, they were the products of nightmare and experience. They became landmarks in what's been called the geography of inexperience, with only a minimal connection with the real world. In the process, they left the world of literature altogether to become myths, myths which carried very different meanings. Now, people think they know these stories, but the stories they think they know are not the stories which were written. These fantasies by gaslight represent one of Britain's greatest and most lasting contributions to the global culture of the 20th century, an era of mass production, mass consumption, and of course, mass destruction.
You can see The Hound of the Baskervilles in its full and fearsome form on BBC One at 1:05 tonight.